When I think back to it all, the thing that stands out most is just how unfair life seemed to my brother from the very beginning. It's not like the world owes anyone an easy ride, but damn, if there was ever a person who deserved one, it was him. We're not blood related. My brother Daniel came into our lives when I was 9 years old, in 1994. He was adopted at the age of 10, after bouncing through foster care for years. Even then, you could see something in him. This quiet determination, this grit that most grown adults don't have. He never complained, never asked for more than what was given, and even as a kid, he worked for everything. We grew up in a small town in the Midwest. You know the type, one grocery store, a main street that rolled up by 8 p.m. On Friday night, high school football was the social event of the week. Money was never abundant in our household. Dad worked construction, not the soft kind either, but the kind where you come home with sunburnt skin, hands so cracked, you can't hold a coffee mug without feeling it. Mom worked part-time at the library and managed the home. Daniel and I shared a bedroom for the first year he lived with us. I remember lying awake some nights, hearing him scribble in this little notebook. I asked him once what he was writing, and he told me, plans. That was Daniel, a planner. He didn't dream in vague ideas, he built blueprints in his head, piece by piece. By the time he was 18, he was already working full-time construction jobs with Dad, learning the trade. He could have taken an easier path, maybe tried for college, but tuition wasn't in the cards, and truthfully, I think he liked the tangible satisfaction of building something with his own two hands. But life didn't make it easy. In his mid-20s, Daniel met Emily. She was the kind of woman who could make a room feel lighter just by walking in, and she balanced Daniel's quiet intensity with warmth and laughter. They married in 2009, right after the financial crash, when everyone was tightening their belts. Then the medical bills came. I won't go into the details, that's his story to tell, but it was one of those situations where no matter how much you worked, it never seemed like enough. But Daniel didn't fold. He never did. He bought a small plot of land from Dad in 2011. Not much, just enough to dream on. And then, brick by brick, literally, he built half a house. When I say half a house, I mean that in the most literal sense. They lived in the finished side, while he fought the bank for a loan to finish the rest. It was months of calls, paperwork, and that polite but firm persistence that Daniel had mastered. Finally, he got it, and the rest of the house went up. That was his first big win. A few years later, things started to change for him. He'd moved into managing big construction projects, the kind you drive over without thinking twice, like highway bridges over rivers. He'd earned respect in the industry for being the guy who didn't cut corners, who solved problems no one else could figure out. By 2015, he sold that first house at a profit and bought a huge spread, 175 acres of rural Midwest land. For Daniel, that wasn't just property, it was freedom. The land had an old farmhouse on it, and though it wasn't perfect, he poured time and money into renovations. Still, it was never quite the dream home he wanted, so he decided to build again. By 2018, the third house was ready, and it was beautiful. Clean lines, open windows, a porch that caught the sunrise perfectly. He decided to sell the old farmhouse but keep the land around it for hunting and farming. Daniel's always been a hunter, not for trophies but for the quiet of it. He liked to walk the woods alone in late autumn, when the air smells like cold leaves and the world feels still. That's when the trouble started. One of our extended relatives, I'll call them Mark and Lisa, reached out. They'd been struggling for years, moving from rental to rental, never quite getting their footing. When they heard Daniel was selling the farmhouse, they asked if he'd consider selling it to them. The thing was, they could only qualify for about half of what it was worth. Daniel didn't even hesitate. He told me later that he remembered what it was like, starting out with nothing, feeling like you were always behind, so he gave them a price that was far below market value. A gift, really. He even made sure the bank was on board, pointing out that the property was worth way more than the loan. The deal closed quickly. Everyone seemed happy. I remember thinking it was one of those rare win-win situations. But life has this way of setting up the first domino long before you even realize a chain is about to fall. At the time, none of us knew how fast things would sour, or how Daniel, the guy who had built bridges over rivers, was about to build a fence that would change everything. The months after Daniel sold the farmhouse to Mark and Lisa felt strange, like walking on thin ice that you know is going to crack, but you don't know when or how. We all pretended things were fine, of course, the kind of pretending families do to keep peace. But I could see it in Daniel's eyes. There was an edge there, a quiet worry that didn't go away. It wasn't until that cold April afternoon in 2019, when I got the call from Daniel, that I realized things were unraveling fast. He'd been driving through the area near the farmhouse and spotted a for sale sign planted firmly in the yard. His stomach sank. He called me right away. "I don't get it," he said, voice tight with disbelief. "They're trying to flip the house already, after just a few months." That was the moment everything shifted for Daniel, for me, and for our entire family. He had given them the house at a steep discount. No strings attached, no fine print. It was a family deal, one of those unwritten agreements where you trust that blood means something. Daniel wasn't a naive guy. He'd been burned before by banks and shady contracts. But family, that was sacred. I remember him pulling up to the property, heart pounding, clutching a rolled-up set of construction plans in his truck bed. He wanted to see with his own eyes what was going on. Mark was there, standing near the porch, looking uncomfortable. Daniel approached calmly, though inside I know the storm was raging. Mark explained they were unhappy with some things about the house. Small stuff, he said, layout quirks, the distance from town, the fact that the property was a little too remote for their needs, so they planned to sell it and buy something more practical. Daniel listened, voice level but firm, as he reminded them what they'd agreed upon, that the discounted sale was because they were family, and he'd expect them to sell it back to him at the same price if things didn't work out. Mark didn't bite. He basically shut the door on that. No compromise, no respect for what Daniel had done. I remember Daniel's gut twisting with a cold sinking feeling. He was gutted, betrayed, but more than that, pissed. Not just because of the money, but because family had taken advantage of his generosity. I think what hit him the hardest was realizing they knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't just a misstep or a change of heart. It was a calculated move, riding on the fact that Daniel was a good guy who gave them a chance when no one else would. That night, I watched Daniel pacing our kitchen, hands deep in his hair, muttering to himself. He told me about all the late nights he'd spent building that house, fighting the bank for loans, and juggling medical bills while trying to provide a future for Emily and their kids. And now, here was a family member treating it like a business transaction with no honor. I asked him what he wanted to do. He paused, eyes burning with something fierce. "I'm going to make sure they remember this." What followed was a slow burn, a gathering storm. Daniel wasn't the kind to lash out recklessly. He thought it through, carefully, strategically, the way he handled every project he managed. But he was also done being a doormat. Early the next morning, I got a text from him with a single photo: fence posts being hammered into the ground, outlining a clear, undeniable boundary. It was a fence on his property, but one that circled the house they still occupied. He told me he'd brought in hog fencing, the kind you use to keep pigs in. I laughed the first time I saw the photo. It felt absurd, like a prank. But Daniel was serious, dead serious. The day Mark saw the fence going up, he stormed out of the house, demanding to know what was happening. Daniel met him at the edge of the new boundary, calm but unyielding. "I'm putting up some hog fence on my land," Daniel said, eyes steady. "Don't worry, I'll put a gate so you can come and go. But just so you know, I've got about 100 pigs lined up from a farmer down the road, ready to move in if this keeps up." Mark's face drained. I could almost hear his thoughts. This guy isn't bluffing. The tension was thick. For a moment, the idea of living surrounded by pigs on what they thought was their discounted family home seemed terrifying. That fence wasn't just wood and wire. It was Daniel's way of saying, "You're playing with fire." You took what was given in good faith, And now you're going to pay the price, one way or another. A few days later, we all met at the bank. The deed transferred back to Daniel without any fuss. The threat alone was enough. Looking back, I realize how much that fence represented. It was a reclaiming of dignity, a statement that generosity isn't weakness, and that family betrayal has consequences. Daniel never had to unleash those pigs. The idea alone was a perfect revenge, practical, symbolic, and rooted in the land he loved. But it wasn't just about property or money. It was about respect, trust, and the unspoken rules that hold families together. When those rules are broken, the fallout isn't just legal, it's deeply personal. In that moment, I saw a new side of Daniel. The quiet, hard-working man who'd never asked for much had found his voice, and it was loud enough to shake the ground beneath that farmhouse, that family, and the whole idea of taking advantage of someone just because you share a last name. The weeks after the fence went up, and the deed slid back across the bank counter was some of the hardest I ever saw Daniel go through. It wasn't like the immediate crisis was over, far from it, but it was like the air had changed. There was a new kind of weight on his shoulders, heavier than the physical work of building houses or managing construction projects. I remember sitting with him one night after the bank meeting, the hum of crickets outside the window mixing with the silence between us. Emily and the kids were upstairs, tucked in bed, probably dreaming of normal things like school, or the new bike Daniel had promised our nephew. But Daniel wasn't dreaming. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his hands clenched into fists on the table. I could see him wrestling with something inside, anger, disappointment, exhaustion, maybe even a kind of grief. We never talked about what Mark and Lisa had done with bitterness or rage. Daniel was too fair for that, but I could tell it had shaken something fundamental in him. You know, when you trust people, family especially, you don't expect them to stab you in the back. You don't expect your generosity to be treated like a weakness to exploit. It breaks something inside you, and it's not easy to put back together. The truth was, Daniel was carrying more than just the burden of that betrayal. He was grappling with what it meant for our family, the people we thought we could count on. I heard whispers from other relatives, some siding quietly with Mark and Lisa, others trying not to get involved. The old family bonds were starting to fray, and it was like watching a slow-motion fracture that no one wanted to admit was happening. Work became both a refuge and a challenge for Daniel. He threw himself into his projects with the same relentless focus he always had, but I could tell the joy wasn't there. The spark that used to light up his eyes when he talked about his work seemed dimmer, more tired. There were nights when I'd get texts from him, short, clipped messages that spoke volumes without spelling it out. Had a rough day, can't shake this feeling. Wish things were different. Sometimes I'd call just to hear his voice, to remind him he wasn't alone in this. But even then, I knew the real battle was internal. I think what made it so hard was that Daniel had always been the strong one, the one who fixed things, who held everything together. And here he was, facing a family fracture that no amount of building or planning could fix. Emily was his rock during this time. I admired how she stood by him, balancing support with her own quiet strength. She never pushed him to talk before he was ready, but I know she saw the pain beneath the surface. There was a moment, about 2 months after the fence incident, when Daniel confided something to me that surprised me. He said he wondered if maybe he'd been too generous, too trusting, if maybe the lesson was that sometimes you have to protect yourself first, even from family. That line hit me hard, because it's not just about money or land, it's about trust, and once that's broken, it's hard to know where to rebuild. On the other side of things, the family dynamics shifted noticeably. Conversations became cautious, gatherings less frequent. It was like an invisible line had been drawn, and everyone was trying to figure out which side they were on. Mark and Lisa kept to themselves mostly, but the tension was palpable whenever they were around. I heard from others that they were still planning to buy a place in town, just like they said, but the ease and warmth they once expected from Daniel's generosity was gone. I tried to be the bridge where I could, but it wasn't easy. Watching a family unravel like that leaves scars that run deep. One thing I noticed about Daniel, though, was that even through all this he never became bitter in a way that destroyed him. He didn't become the angry man everyone warned he might. Instead, he got quieter, more deliberate. He started writing again, not just plans for construction, but journals where he processed everything. I got a glimpse of some of those entries once. They were raw, honest, full of self-doubt and strength tangled up together. "I'm learning who I am without their approval," one line read. Another said, "Sometimes protecting what you build means standing alone." Daniel's story during those months was less about the house, the fence, or even Mark and Lisa. It was about something bigger, the difficult, messy work of holding on to your own dignity when the people closest to you let you down. I think that's what most people don't see when they look at someone like Daniel. They see the hard hats, the construction sites, the houses and bridges. But beneath that exterior is a man who's been tested by life in ways most of us can't imagine. By late 2019, Daniel started to talk about plans again, bigger projects, new opportunities. But this time there was a new edge to his vision. He wasn't just building for himself or his family. He was building to reclaim respect, to set a standard. And slowly, very slowly, the family began to heal, not because wounds disappeared, but because Daniel chose to take control of the narrative. After months of sitting with the hurt, the betrayal, and the unraveling of trust, Daniel reached a point where he knew he had to act, not just for himself, but for his family, for his dignity, and for the message he wanted to send. It wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about making clear that kindness without respect was a one-way street, and that sometimes you have to draw a line, literally and figuratively. You have to understand, Daniel is not the kind of guy who flies off the handle. He's methodical, precise, the sort of person who, when faced with a problem, doesn't lash out but breaks it down and solves it piece by piece. That's how he's managed to build those huge infrastructure projects that most people take for granted. Bridges spanning rivers, highways carving through endless plains, things that require a calm mind under pressure. So when he decided to confront the situation with Mark and Lisa, it wasn't some spur-of-the-moment tantrum. It was a carefully crafted move, one he planned with the same thoroughness he applied to any major build. The day he drove out to the farmhouse with that roll of fencing in the back of his truck, he told me later it felt like the first moment in a long time where he was reclaiming his power. There was a rush in that, not from anger, but from justice, served quietly and firmly. He started hammering fence posts into the ground around the perimeter of his property, making sure every inch was on his side of the boundary. And yes, it was hog fencing, the kind that keeps pigs in and people out. When Mark came out, confused and angry, Daniel didn't raise his voice. He just explained, in his calm, matter-of-fact way, what was happening. He told them he had lined up about 100 pigs ready to move in if the situation didn't get resolved. That was the turning point. The fence wasn't just a fence, it was a symbol, a warning, a reminder that generosity was not to be taken for granted. I think what made this so effective wasn't just the threat of pigs roaming around, it was the sheer practicality and groundedness of it. Daniel knew the land, he understood farming, hunting and rural life better than most. And that fence meant more than property lines. It meant boundaries in relationships, boundaries in respect. There's something deeply satisfying about watching a man who's been pushed to the edge calmly and confidently take control of his story. No shouting, no threats, just quiet, stubborn resolve. I remember telling Daniel at one point, "You're playing chess while they're still figuring out checkers." And that's exactly what he was doing. Of course, it wasn't easy. There were days he second-guessed himself, wondering if he was stooping to their level, if maybe forgiveness would have been the better path. But he knew that some lessons have to be learned the hard way, especially when family lines get blurred by selfishness. That fence stayed up for a while, though the pigs never had to come. The message was clear, and soon enough, Mark and Lisa agreed to meet at the bank and transfer the deed back to Daniel. When that happened, Daniel told me he felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that justice was served, but sorrow that it had come to this, that family had fractured so badly over something that should have been simple respect and honesty. But what amazed me most was how Daniel didn't let this break him. Instead, it made him stronger. He started taking on new projects with renewed vigor, but now with a sharper edge. A man who had learned that generosity and trust were precious, but also fragile. In the end, the fence wasn't just about property or pigs. It was about standing up when it mattered, drawing lines that others dared not cross, and showing that kindness does not mean weakness. And maybe, just maybe, it reminded all of us that family isn't just about blood. It's about the respect and integrity you choose to uphold. It's strange how sometimes the biggest battles we fight don't happen in the public eye or on some grand stage. They happen quietly, in the corners of our lives, in moments that feel small but carry the weight of everything we've been through. Watching Daniel's story unfold, I realized that the real victory wasn't just reclaiming a piece of land or winning back a house. It was something deeper, something that can't be measured in dollars or deeds. The day the deed transferred back to Daniel, there was a heavy silence among us. No triumphant cheers or grand speeches, just a shared understanding that this chapter was closing. But the story wasn't quite finished yet. For Daniel, that house, the land, and even that fence were symbols of everything he'd built with sweat, patience, and heart. Losing it to family who didn't honor the deal wasn't just a financial blow, it was a wound to his pride and faith in those closest to him. But when the deed was finally his again, he didn't gloat or celebrate. Instead, he told me quietly that he felt a weight lifted, like he'd reclaimed not just property, but dignity. That feeling was priceless. In the weeks and months that followed, Daniel kept busy. He poured himself into projects that mattered, bridges, roads, homes. But I noticed a shift in him, subtle but profound. He was kinder but more cautious, more open yet guarded. It was as if that betrayal had taught him a lesson about love and trust, that both are worth giving. But sometimes you have to protect yourself first. Family gatherings were different too. The tension that once hung in the air slowly eased, replaced by a wary peace. I think we all learned something about the fragile balance between generosity and expectation. One afternoon, a few years later, Daniel took me hunting on that land he'd kept all along. We sat quietly under a canopy of rustling leaves, the sun filtering through the trees, and I asked him what he thought about everything now, about the fence, the pigs, the fight. He looked out across the fields and said, "Sometimes you have to stand firm, even when it hurts the most, because if you don't, you lose more than just land, you lose yourself." I never forgot that, not just because it was true for him, but because it's true for all of us. Boundaries aren't just lines on a map, they're the lines we draw to protect who we are. The story of the hog fence spread quietly through our small town, told in hushed tones over coffee and at the diner. Some people saw it as a clever bit of revenge, others as a lesson in standing up for yourself. But for me, it was a reminder that even when family betrays you, you can find strength in yourself to turn the tables, with grace, with patience, and yes, with a little bit of that quiet, stubborn fire. Looking back now, I don't think Daniel's story is just about a house or a fence. It's about resilience, about justice that isn't loud but lasting, about the messy, complicated nature of family, where love and hurt are often tangled together. And it's about how sometimes the best revenge is simply standing tall and letting your actions speak louder than words. That's Daniel, the hardest working man I know, the man who built bridges and fences alike, the man who taught me that dignity is worth fighting for, no matter what.